could kind of lead in here for, let me give you a little background because people don't probably exactly know who I am. That I started in this business a long time ago, as you can imagine. But back in the 70s, I came across a group of musicians that were selling their blood to make the payment on their musical instruments, which I found curious. And so I sponsored their band. The band's name was Ozone, and they had a dream. They felt that if everybody could listen to their sound and come together, that there'd be peace and harmony, which worked for me. But anyway, so I needed to find something for them to do. So I decided to start a business. And because I was in transmission lines and that sort of thing at the time, I went into the cable business. And they initially worked for me. A couple of them have retired from the company here recently after 35 years. But my objective when I came here wasn't selling cable. I mean, it was obviously central to where everything went at the end of the day. The largest part of my business is not cable, for what it's worth. Well, I came into this industry, I introduced myself to everybody and said, what can I do for you? I'm talking about all the people who were perceived as competitors in one thing or another. And my objective always was to join everything together, and kind of help the musicians reproduce their music as the case may be. So early on, Bill and I crossed paths, as early as could be. And I think his employees thought I was crazy. I'm not sure what he thought. But I met him in an elevator at a CES show with a piece of cable cut open around my neck, and I got some pretty odd looks, But over the years, my offer to all the manufacturers was taken up to a degree that that's the largest part of the business now. So I actually have essentially three businesses. I've got the cable business. I've got the OEM business, which is supplying all the manufacturers with everything from solder to connectors to everything else. And I also have a wire manufacturing plant, which basically I sell to anybody that wants the product. But anyway, Bill and I go way back. I remember a party used to be something called Rec.Audio High End. And I had a party at my house for basically everybody that hung out on that board, and sat Bill down in front of my stereo system and gave him a stereo ride. And I'll bet he still remembers that.
I remember going out to Cucamonga, Ontario, something.
Ontario, yeah.
Okay. Well, George is actually the kid, even if he's the one with hair. To the extent that I started making cable in 1978 and started AudioQuest in 1980. I think, George, you're 1987. When did Cardis Audio start?
Oh, probably not until 84 or something like that officially, maybe a little earlier. It took me a couple of years to get up to speed. I was following in your wake. I can remember many experiences going into places to try and get my product, and where you made it through the door first. And I got some interesting responses.
Well, Southern California was the home turf in that sense for both of us. Before the first CES I exhibited at was the Jockey Club 1981, Winter CES. And prior to that, I had 42 dealers in Southern California and one in Denver. So Southern California was home turf.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people came out of Southern California. Southern California had a vibe to it or something, even if you look at people who are on the East Coast now, how many of them started out in California? It was an audio community. We were talking about Brooks Burdan earlier, GNP. So many of us are not here anymore, but he was very instrumental in the early days for me.
Bill, you mean Brooks? You mean Bill Gross,
Yeah.
who's very much playing at the field that because
Yeah, yeah.
he created one of the largest internet incubators on the planet. Uh, there was some controversy about it, but yeah, Bill is an amazing example of he was a student at Caltech uh, and kind of an audio nerd besides being a computer and other things, uh, and started building speakers in his dorm room kind of thing. The dorm room thing is pretty common. Jim Davis, who owns MoFi, was doing retail from his dorm room. Many of us began in our college days. So Bill started with speakers, and then he was successful enough that he opened a store to sell the speakers, which was Gross National Product, GMP. And then that became a full-fledged, one of the most relevant stores in Pasadena area. Uh, and he then wrote software to manage his business, which he then sold to Lotus and then went to work for Lotus. So some of us go and join the big world, and some of us stay in the wonders of the audio community.
We're going to be okay, Bill. Um,
It'll work out. We just didn't become billionaires, but
yeah.
it's all right. We're having a good time.
No, I never met Bill, but Brooks was one of the early people and he was an audio consultant as he billed himself, and he sat on a throne inside of GMP. He had a platform he sat on, and he fixed turntables and one thing or another, and he was a golden ear guy of some sort, which I would have to acknowledge. And so I went to him and said, hey, I'm thinking about going into this business. And he, of course, advised me not to. But I went, okay, whatever, but maybe you better sit down and listen to what I got. And he says, well, I'm an audio consultant. So I gave him $100, which at the time was a lot of money for me. I was a poor boy. And he sat down, listened to the product, and said, okay, I get it. It sounds really good, but you can't sell this, and stopped me from selling it because it didn't have the right eye appeal and feel and so on. So I had to actually scrap my first run and go back to getting the cosmetics and the feel of the product right. And he was right, I'm sure. But things were very different back then. Some of the cables back then were so stiff they were like a piece of, actual cable. But anyway, so that's Brooks guided me for a long time.
Retail.
That's you're retail.
I think you skipped that stage.
I did
Many
actually.
of us were in retail first. I first made cable for my little store and appointment only store in Santa Monica. Although I don't know if, I think some of you might also share our generational age category. Remember Middleton White and Kemp in Anaheim,
No.
which was they were in a light industrial park, but a very nice showroom, uh, and definitely one of the best high end. High end didn't mean expensive so much in those days. Uh, back in when it came out in 1978, the NAD 3020 $175 integrated amplifier was high end because it's really what I call merit-based audio as compared to the real world where high end means the tennis racket that costs the most, the sneakers that cost the most, the golf club that costs the most. But high end, uh, majority of the time, not exclusively, did not mean the most expensive, which was the luxury business, which was not always performance oriented. High end were products that didn't necessarily look good, didn't necessarily have any status, uh, but survived or found a place for themselves in the market on performance, how they sounded.
Yeah, it was a cult of people who made the decisions on that, I think. It was listening was a big part of it. I'm really pretty much went into this from a mathematical corner, a bunch of dreams and math and so on. You obviously uh, did it by ear, which was have total respect, but which I can discuss later. Um,
The seeds were someone else's listening, which is why I'm crediting Middleton White and Kemp. Uh, I had been in retail in Portland, Oregon, starting in 1973. In 76, had moved to the Bay Area and was a rep for a year, which I was not cut out to be an independent rep. I can only sell the things that I'm either personally recommending or made responsible for myself. The rep relationships, you can't curate what you're selling well enough, and I'm sort of proud to have been a failure. Um, that
Good
was
to
my
hear.
year in Palo Alto, and then I moved down to Santa
Mhm.
Monica, was a rep for most of the following year. But when I sold my samples in the LA Classifieds, uh, a fellow I met as a result of that bought $5,000, which, as George said, was a lot of money back then. $5,000 Audio Research Magnepan system, and I said, "Well, gee, if I can do that when I'm not even trying, maybe I'm better at retail than I am at being a rep." And so originally executive audio in Santa Monica in 1978, I wanted to have cable because at that time it was Megami Cable, which is a huge company, like saying Belden. Belden,
Yeah.
Canary, and Megami are, at least in the US, three of the best known. I call them competent competent cable manufacturers because their manufacturing is extremely competent. But I also use competent as an insult because being competent is not good enough to be worth buying in our business. In our business, the greater insights, experimentation that they don't teach you in engineering school is necessary. Better, especially for speakers, but really for any of the audio products. Competent is a minimum level, and then to get above that, that you can just hire any old engineer to do, requires bridge building, combination of engineering, science, scientific investigation, acknowledgement of empirical experience. And you could say a touch of artistry, which is really just incorporating the fact that using our perceptual system with methodology is scientific. It is not snake oil to
Oh
listen.
yeah, for sure.
Uh, Human cognition, any animal cognition, is not accurate. We are highly distorted in the way that we see and hear the world. Uh, Animals cope with reality. No animal has, as a result of environmental pressure, become a perfect historian. So we actually have not a very good sense of reality, which is how come stereo exists. That
Oh yeah.
sense, that virtual image, uh, the image specificity that in real life is, well, in real life, like if you're hunting or you're about to be eaten, is of course crucial. But in a concert, there's really not the type of imaging specificity that I value so highly in audio, which is the result of our being wrong. Our algorithms are wrong. Our interpretation of sound coming from two speakers, and then we do not hear a three-dimensional sound field. We make it up. It's a fantasy. And isn't it delightful? So incorporating how effective is the audio at, at human response is that additional ingredient that if a speaker manufacturer designer has it, doesn't have it, then they're going to make a mediocre speaker. Cable seems so simple. George can explain better than I can why it's not so simple.
I can
Uh,
make it complicated. You know much more about keeping things simple than I do, obviously. Um, that's for sure. There's a
but
lesson in that.
So I wanted to have a better cable than Jonas Miller's Megami cable, which was really just a very high capacitance, low inductance coax, because Ken Kreisel, M&K, who was sort of the second in charge at Jonas Miller's store in Beverly Hills, uh, copied, in a sense, the electrical parameters of the Polk Cobra cable, which was introduced to the US in June of 1976, which was a braided, I'm not even sure it actually qualifies as a Litz cable. It was used magnet wire. Litz cable is not so well, many, Litz in German means strand. Litz in English is a particular arrangement of generally magnet wire, but it doesn't have to be. But it's an arrangement of strands such that all strands have, have the same skin effect. So George's cables are not Litz cables, even though they use magnet wire. Uh, and that's why I don't know that the Cobra cable, which was a braided Litz, or braided magnet wire cable, was technically a Litz or not, but it was called that. Very very high capacitance, 454 picofarads a foot, I believe, 9 ohm characteristic impedance. Again, I always thought that that's kind of a garbage way
Mhm.
to priority
Yeah.
in cable design, but that came first, and the result was that Bruce Meyer, who was dishwasher, brought out smog lifters, which was a bunch of twisted pairs next to each other, kind of like Weber wire or what uh, Tower Labs Matthew Bond is doing today under his Matthew Bond Limited name. Very high capacitance, low inductance cable. Uh, the Cobra cable is responsible for an awful lot of amplifiers blowing up or overheating. So Polk sold a little Terminator kit to prevent the compatibility problems with lesser amplifiers. So anyway, that was the ecology of the time, and I wanted to have a cable for my store. And good fortune for me, Middleton White and Kemp, good friends with Dave Gore. And again, some of you must recognize some of these names because I think you're maybe as old as I am. So Quattro gain cell amplifier, the GG250, that was Dave Gore. And Dave Gore read an article in Hi-Fi News and Record Review by Martin Collins, uh, talking about his experimentation based on provocation from Jan Haraga, who's the editor of New Revel de Son, Paris publication. And I was very disappointed many years later to meet John in Paris because he's actually kind of a limited technocrat. He's not the one who brings in artistry, but he was stirring up the pot for Cables Make a Difference. Martin Collins did a bunch of his own listening and came up with a rough conclusion that finely stranded magnet wire seemed to be an advantage. Dave Gore went down to a medical supply place in Canoga Park, north of Woodland Hills, and bought some 15 gauge medical Litz cable. I took it down to Middleton White and Kemp. They attached 2 conductors to an electric drill and a doorknob, made up a twisted pair, and compared that 15 gauge twisted pair to the aught, anyway, bigger than 0, aught something welding cable that Middleton White and Kemp were using as their speaker cable. And that little 15 gauge that looked like where is it compared to the giant welding cable sounded better.
No doubt.
And as a result, and then in order to make a custom order of cable, Middleton invited me to go in 50-50 with them on a custom order for our first cable, which was a twisted pair, 12 gauge, 435 strands per side. It was a Litz cable. And it was better than Fulton Gold. It was better than the Megami. It was the best thing we'd ever heard or that anybody had heard that we played it for at the time.
Mm.
And as I refer to that as original recipe, I fell into it.
Mhm.
It's sort of like if Starbucks was not started by the fellow who turned it into Starbucks we know today, McDonald's was not started by Kroc. He noticed where there was a restaurant in San Bernardino that was buying an incredible number of milkshake machines, and he was curious, and so he bought their business. So there's layers to the history of almost anybody, and
You have a,
that
you
was
have
how
a
I
spec-
got into the cable business.
you have a spectacular memory. But going back to the beginning of what you were saying there, I think that the key here was separating your expectations from what you were actually hearing, which required a state of mind, so to speak, required a place. And it was a cult of sort, particularly in China, to be able to sort these things out. And I very much enjoyed that. I thought that it was an evolutionary thing of sorts, being able to do that. I can remember times when I would have a mixer or board or something. I would turn a knob, whatever the knob might be, and you would hear the difference in the cable. One day I was doing that, and I was very clearly the difference I heard. And yet, when I woke up, I figured out, well, that knob was disconnected. It wasn't doing anything at all, even though I perceived that it was. And mistakes like this led down a pathway to uh, my own evolution in the listening thing, as well as trusting the ears of my daughters, who seem to not have the problem. But but as to your Litz thing, I don't I think that the original ones were, a lot of them were woven to, they wanted all the strands to come out the same length, which is certainly an objective, and it met certain criteria. Um, I was different. I came from a different sort of place because I was an engineer. I grew up in the telephone company and did transmission lines over the years. I realized really early on that there used to be, you'd had the wires going along the railroad tracks you'd see with just individual strands, and you could go one end of a country to another on those things, and it worked. It was a little echoey and whatnot, but it worked just fine. But pretty soon there was just no room for any more wires. So Bell System at the time put out a reward. They'd give $1 million a year, which was a lot of money in 1905, to anybody who could come up with a solution to the problem. And because what happened was when they put it in a cable and they mixed dielectric in one, they could go, 1,000 yards or something. You couldn't understand the conversation anymore. So it was smeared and blurry, and didn't work. Well, the guy that came up with the solution was a guy named Pupin. And Pupin went, well, the problem here is that the propagation in the cable itself is 97% of the speed of light, or whatever it is, based upon the discharge rate of the dielectric. But the wire itself, the propagation rate was much higher, or substantially higher. So you got an accumulated space between the two propagating signals, and they blurred each other out. And that's why the telephone cables didn't work initially. So he said, well, the solution is pretty simple. And he says, what we have to do is every 1,000 feet or so along the cable, well, let's just stick a coil of wire in there and slow things down. Well, that solved the overall accumulated difference between the two places. But in between, you still had the smears, so things became much more intelligible, but there still was a limit to how far you could go. So when I looked at that, I went, well, hell, this is what you really have to do, is you have to slow the conductor down to match the dielectric. So at which point I was using doorknobs and drill motors, and I made an interesting observation. If you took strands of wire, say magnet wire, hooked them to your doorknob or whatever you were going to hook it to, and you put it in the drill motor, at some point it would start pulling you towards it. The wire would shrink. And then I realized, well, hell, that all we had to do is match that shrinkage to what's going on, to what's the speed of the dielectric, so to speak, and you could do that mathematically easy enough. And that was the purposes of using the twisted magnet wire thing. And then because I'm obsessive, I began to realize that, well, there's this skin effect thing you talked about, which really isn't skin effect, it's core effect. The effect isn't in the skin's constant. The problem is the deeper you go in the dielectric, the more things slow down. So you had to compensate for that somehow, or you ended up with an internal smear in the conductor itself, which granted is much less, but like I say, I'm obsessive. So what I had to do is I had to scale the conductor so the strands became smaller in proportion to inclusion factor, or how much the strand was included in the mass, which led to the use of the golden ratio thing, which I had already used for other purposes already, just to stop the resonance between the strands. So yes, it's not LITS, it's something else. The purpose was different. It wasn't to make the conductor the same, it was to make it to match the cable. And that and 100 other details, which led down to the next thing on the path, which was the wire itself, which at the time I realized early on that the purer coppers work better at the end of the day. And I began to realize that, gee, there's quite a bit of difference here. The curious thing on all of this was something that you came up with, which I found very fascinating, which didn't apply to me for some reason, but it definitely applied to you. That the cables could be directional based upon which way you put them. And of course, this drove people nuts. I mean, wire's wire. Why would it be different one way than it is the other? Well, the fact of the matter, it is. And so here recently, I began focusing on that for whatever reasons. And sure as shit, I came up with test methods and one thing or another where I could measure and basically scientifically demonstrate that what you'd observed was true. And it was basically an artifact of the drawing process. So particularly in the cheaper wires, the less pure wires, it was very prominent. So I came up with methods for making very, very pure copper and very, very soft annealed copper so that it didn't have that directionality. And I didn't realize what I'd done, but because when I layer my stuff, I'm swapping directions every other layer anyway, so it didn't seem to matter as much to me as it did to you. But I totally respect the fact that you figured that out early on. Uh, and I basically applied for a patent on this, not for any protection or anything of that sort. Most patents are just for disclosure, and that you depend sort of on the honor of the people around you to not tread on top of you too heavy, But no, just disclosure, and I intend to put both of our names on it, just for the heck of it, just to say that we did. I think so much that's been achieved here through our cooperation, both directions. These things are always go two ways, and including what we've done technically, as well as the employees we've had and swapped back and forth, which is totally another story. But we've become family over the years. And I think that the sharing of the details of things that you and I have both done by our completely different methods kind of went in with our both sort of spectral minds. And good to be here.
Good to be here. And it is a wonderful, long-standing, unofficial but true relationship between Cardis Audio and AudioQuest. Because Mary Cardis, your oldest daughter, was my international sales manager for several years in the 90s. Then Scott Brooks, who worked for me, was important. I don't know if he was sales manager, what the role was. Andy Reagan has worked for everybody. Cardis, his first manufacturer job was Transparent Cable. AudioQuest was second. Then he went to Meridian, but somewhere along the line to you.
He worked for Noel in there somewhere, didn't he?
That was later. That was after you. But yes, he was at Noel for a surprisingly long time. He's president of Dan Clark Audio Headphones now. So he moved into headphones while at Monster. But yeah, Andy's been more places in the industry than probably any one other.
He's an amazing guy.
Andy's a force of nature.
Well, Andy is a genius in a chaotic situation, which I had when I moved up here, and I had issues, ended up with my middle daughter going a different way. And so she retires and goes over the horizon. Now I got a business. I don't know how to run a business. I don't have a clue. Maybe I have a clue, but these people are all just friends and family and stuff that have basically brought each other into the business. The overall business itself, I'm not a businessman. I'm a dreamer, and so I brought Andy in and he did, in fact, in a very chaotic situation, pull it together marvelously. He was very insightful and amazing. But Andy's mind is sort of like ours. It just keeps on churning, And at some point in time, there wasn't any chaos. There was peace and harmony, and everything was working great. Now, that's not Andy's strong point. He's much better if there's problems to solve, which maybe we are too. So, but anyway, he did a lot of good. He was a good man.
That jives with the majority of Andy's stories are of him as a roadie for high percentage of the world's rock bands, which is a new version of Turbulence every single night. Definitely have to be living on a frontier to do. So Andy's a good frontiers person, I guess. Another way of putting it. Directionality, we do see it differently. The fact that we cooperate and we're great friends doesn't mean we see everything the same way. So directionality is a friend. I had no idea it was a friend for years, and I enjoyed when...
That's an opinion.
Yes. Well, I had thought, and so did you when you first brought a sample of when you were trying to make a cable wire that you thought was less directional. It was less directional, but it was still directional. That using the cable in the direction that didn't sound as good was a negative. and using the direction in which it sounded better was neutral, as though there was zero and negative. Uh, what I did not realize until I hired Garth Powell, 2012, I tried to hire him 8 years earlier from Furman, but he was there for life. But then they stopped developing their products, and 3 years of not being able to improve the Furman Power products, he became available, and so we have Niagara and PowerQuest today from AudioQuest. But Garth thought about directionality for about a week and saw something that, to me, now that I've seen it, so to speak, is like, well, yeah, of course. But I probably would never have thought of it the rest of my life
Well,
without
I think you're talking about directionality of the cable,
the
which I
wire.
totally can.
The wire.
Well,
I'm talking
just
about I'm talking about the metal, purely the metal
the
bias.
metal itself. Okay.
The metal itself, drawn metal, as you referred to, has naturally something of a chevron shape. It's not
Yeah.
a symmetrical, mechanically symmetrical relative to the,
Grain structure. Yeah.
and that whether it's the internal turbulence, because we're coming out with some metals that are amorphous on the surface and there is no directionality at the surface, but they're still directional. Thank heavens, because I wouldn't want to lose directionality. It's proportional to frequency. Skin effect, whereas I think you referred to as core effect, but it's
Mhm.
usually with common language or something, is skin.
Yeah.
The reason that you don't get electrocuted when you're on an airplane or in a car and it's hit by lightning is skin effect. And George, please do correct this. I always want to be corrected if I phrase any bit of this incorrectly. But the reason that skin effect is proportional to frequency, it's the rate of change.
Yeah.
Lightning might be direct current, but it is an extremely fast transition. So it's the equivalent of a very high frequency. Uh, and the old,
Actually, if I can correct you on that, that if you look at lightning is builds up, it's a charge builds up in the cloud, and then for an instant it resonates. And there's a resonance in the column, and that resonance ionizes the air, and then the current follows that resonance because the air is ionized. So the initial part of it is actually AC, based on resonance.
okay,
You-
that's so the foundation is you're saying is an AC phenomenon.
Yeah,
Uh, okay, thank you. Uh, but the part about fast and high frequency transition
yeah,
is that the old, and maybe it's the wrong term, so please, George, the existing magnetic field can't get out of the way fast enough.
yeah,
And
exactly.
so the new energy goes on the skin of the airplane, the skin of the car, and you're safe inside.
Or Nikola Tesla's skin when he held up the rod sitting on his device.
Uh, and so the higher the frequency, and this is true at audio frequencies, the higher the frequency, the greater the reduction in current density away from the surface of the conductor. The only place that has 100%, just referring to the conductor and not what happens once it's got a relationship between positive, negative, and other values, uh, is the surface is the only place that has 100% current density at all frequencies. And then you get standard versions of what is acceptable skin depth, but it's not a cliff. It's a question of how much either loss of amplitude, which is what most engineers are taught is relevant, or in the case of audio, inductance and phase shift is what's relevant and not the loss of amplitude. They go to one, but if you had a 10% loss of power in a 14 gauge cable or something because of skin effect, and you don't, it's less than that. But so what? You turn up your volume control knob less than you can hardly even move it. Tiniest fraction of a dB. So our problem is not amplitude, but when some engineer goes into a hi-fi store and harasses them with, there's no such thing as skin affected audio frequencies. Well, if they know enough to use the word skin effect, they know there's skin affected audio frequencies.
Yeah.
What you're saying is there's no relevant loss of amplitude due to skin effect uh, in the length of audio cables I use in my home. And they're right. Functionally, there's zero. But they're ignoring that inductance rises 1 to 1 with impedance as you go away from the surface of a conductor. And along with that inductance is a time delay. The number of degrees is relatively small, but it is the same signal arriving over time, like touching a wet oil painting or a finger painting.
Yeah, it's Charlie Hansen, the late great Charlie Hansen said it was spooge factor.
I had forgotten that he had used that term. I was going to mention Charlie for a different reason, which is that in the early '90s, Charlie and I had a bunch of he's a fascinating fellow to talk to.
Uh,
Fascinating,
chief
a lot of
engineer.
conversations about directionality because he had noticed all the same things that I was noticing. He went, I 100% agreed with him, but I hadn't put it in these terms. And they were not, he was being careful, but he also was the incorrect electrical parameters that he was referring to. He had noticed that uh, the conductor going to, say, the positive side of a speaker and the conductor going to the negative needed to face the same direction, not like it was a DC loop. Both needed to be pointing the same way. And if that was pointing to the speaker, then if the same cable was used as a power cable, then the directionality was to the wall, away from the amplifier in both cases. And so Charlie made the comment, it was as if, again, he was careful, there was a mechanism akin to diode rectification, minimizing the amount of RF getting into an active circuit. And the minimizing RF getting into an active circuit part was correct. And I don't understand electronics well enough, but Garth Powell has explained to me that, and I believe him, diode rectification is the wrong analogy to say that it's akin to. But the point is that the asymmetrical structure on the, like shingles on a roof, or fish scales at the surface of a conductor at the microscopic level, uh, causes a minuscule difference in impedance at RF frequencies. And the rule of following
Okay.
the path of least resistance means that the RF, the induced RF picked up on the metal, on the conductor, will have a high percentage that will go in the direction that you steer it to, by choosing which end. It's the exact same mechanism, and I shouldn't over exaggerate the name. It's the same mechanism as when you have a shielded pair. So when Mike Moffett and I in 1980 were the first companies to start making single-ended cable that used balanced cable. That was a twisted pair with a shield, and the shield is only connected to one end. That which end should the shield be attached at? Well, empirical evidence, because that's all I had to go on. And that's most of what's been true in my life. I'm a history major, I'm not qualified in electrical engineering at all. But that also has saved me from thinking that I knew something and then misapplying it. So being
Oh
ignorant
yeah.
has its own strengths.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, so I attached the shield at the load end, at the amplifier end of a cable that was going, say, from a preamp to a power amp. Although I didn't put arrows on the cable because Bryston, Bryston was one of the early wide bandwidth amplifiers and marginally unstable or easily provoked into instability. And if you dumped the RF specifically on the input of the Bryston, it sounded harsh and irritating. So before I was honoring directionality of metal, I was honoring the same mechanism, which is where do you steer the RF to? Because when you have a shield only connected to one end, you're fundamentally steering the RF to that end. And the consistent rule is it should be sourced to load. But
It's probably true.
I didn't have that terminology, and I wasn't thinking in those terms. I just knew this is what sound better, and this is what we did. But I put 1 and 2 on the ends of the cable and said normally it would be 1 to 2, but please listen for yourself because sometimes it's 2 to 1, without calling out Bryston as the reason why I did
Yeah.
not put arrows on cables until some years later when Bryston built more stable amplifiers.
Well, I think that essentially what you're saying here is verifiable, but maybe not for the exact same reasons. That in the phone company where I came from, every cable, you would get engineering specifications on it. And they would tell you what the loss was at given points based upon little modules you put that had certain capacitance and inductance. But you would have to do this not by ear, but essentially you used a scope and a board where you could just take what they visualized the specs were in the cable and put them together in a series circuit. Well, what you were determining here is something called build-out capacitance that basically how much capacitance you had to add to the cable at the originating end in order to make it symmetrical overall, so it didn't resonate, which kind of comes back to the same place, but not exactly the same reasons. Now, with respect to the directionality, with respect to RF, that yes, there would be different one direction than the other for various reasons, but the whole trip here is that it's asymmetrical. I mean, not the fact that it's simply that it's different or more on one and less on the other, it's that it's not symmetrical. And so when you get a resonance in the cable, it can demodulate essentially, because if it's asymmetrical, then to some degree it's like a diode, and it just basically makes crap, white noise sort of that trails the transients in the cable. So I think we've both dealt it in our own ways. A second here, I got to make a modification in my system here.
And I think, Chip, you said 45 minutes was when some sort of transition was going to take place.
That's the stuff, isn't it?
Let me turn on here. Yes, we can take a break now if you guys are ready. I would guess we would be back at about let's make it 51 minutes to the hour.
Okay, you got it.
I'll
And
put
in
us
Are we
4 minutes.
synchronized? Are we synchronizing our watches?
I'll put it on pause and we will be back in about 5 minutes. Is there a question that has been asked that you guys can answer from the chat?
I don't know. I can't see the chat, so.
Okay.
I was just enjoying reconnecting with a friend from 1978 who came to my apartment in Santa Monica as my appointment-only hi-fi store. The first thing he said when he walked in, and he was an IRS field auditor, was like, "Wow, this is legitimate." That I was actually running a true business and not claiming something that wouldn't be allowed. Thank you, Jerry.
Oh, this was interesting. I did see this come by. Doesn't this talking about the lightning thing, doesn't the actual discharge after the ionized column is formed go from ground to cloud?
Good question. Very good question. It depends on whether you're in the northern or southern hemisphere generally. That ionosphere is charged asymmetrically, just basically from the solar wind and the magnetic field. So sometimes it goes ground to cloud and sometimes cloud to ground, and it has a very different, distinctive sound. It's very cracky in the southern hemisphere.
Very interesting.
And if you are in an airplane flying very high, you will see that there's a lightning bolt that goes to the ground, and then there's a flash up above that goes up to the ionosphere, and it's usually colored, more or less like Northern Lights type thing.
I do have one. I love this one from a aficionado who I happen to know. Why do cables sound different?
Because they do so many things wrong.
Yeah, essentially.
That is the absolute starting point to understanding all audio, is not what they do things do right, but less wrong. And there are a lot of mechanisms. But many an engineer, if they haven't had cause to be educated in the finer details of wire, it's just a straight line on a circuit as though it has no values. And at a simplistic level, compared to some other components, it's not a capacitor. A piece of metal by itself is not a capacitor. It doesn't have the attributes of the other parts on a circuit board. But
yeah, and it is in many ways the weakest link with respect to the signal. Now, once you get to the speaker, all bets are off. But the symmetry of the cable has a big effect on the sound of what the system is going to do, because it represents a certain resonance in itself. And the proof of that is interesting, that you can take a signal generator and you can make any waveform you want. You can make a triangle, a square, or whatever. Go down the list. I mean, it'll make anything you want. You can even custom make it, and it will come out of that signal generator faithfully into any scope at all. And you can look at it and go, yeah, okay, Now, it will do that until such time as you put a piece of cable in it. As soon as you try and get it to go through a piece of cable, suddenly that symmetry's gone. So the definite truth of an amplifier far exceeds that of a cable. So the biggest factor between your source and the speaker, between the two transducers, as it may be, is the cable, not the amplifier.
But to throw in some mechanisms. So impedance is the one that gets the most attention. People understand amplitude. Phase is not something we're born being aware of. But at some point in the relationship between an amplifier and a loudspeaker, then an impedance is relevant. Although I spent much of my AudioQuest life explaining that it's not the be all and end all. So there comes a point in a designer, cable designer's work of choosing how to allocate a budget.
Well,
And size of speaker cable not only costs more to have more metal, especially if it's good metal, like I buy from George, but as a single strand gets larger, the skin effect becomes worse and the sound is horrible. So we both use multiple conductors in quite different configurations. But so how to have the sound that is other than impedance as undamaged as a single strand while having many times more metal in order to provide a sufficient relationship between an amplifier and a loudspeaker and preserve damping factor and such. Then this current compression impedance mismatch. I referred earlier to the smog lifters and the Weber wire and the original Polk Cobra cables all being cables that were based around the idea of impedance matching, but speakers don't have constant impedance, and amplifiers, certainly not solid state, don't have the same output impedance as the input impedance of a speaker. So to me, this is just a really bogus phenomenon to think of. George will explain more in a second, but it still is an impedance mismatch, and in both our power cables and in speaker cables where current delivery as compared to voltage for an interconnect, then current compression can be substantially reduced by having a cable with no characteristic impedance. Go ahead, George.
Okay.
You've got a lot
So
to
with
say.
respect to impedance, some of the original question is why do cables sound different? Well, largely the reason they sound different is because we don't match impedance. And the audio systems are built on a rising impedance. And the reason for that is you only require half as much amplification, half as much power. Save a nickel, save a dime somewhere along the line, but someone way back decided that having balanced impedance system where the originating and terminating impedance were the same was not a good idea. And I think it was to save pennies somewhere along the line in somebody's amplifier or something, and that's the decision they made. Certainly with respect to impedance, the balance system where you have originating and terminating being the same has an advantage from the cable viewpoint. It may not from the amplifier viewpoint, because you need twice as many amplifiers to do it correctly and twice as much amplification. So that's a real basic answer to the question. It's because audio chose to have a rising impedance system. And originally was set, particularly in the interconnect side, was set up around relatively high impedance coaxes and stuff. Conductor basically from the inside out. So it's like I said, it's more what's going on in the core. And it's a function of how big the conductor is. The bigger you make the conductor, the deeper the core is. So the deeper the core is, the more it's flowed towards the center, and a higher percentage of the count of the signal gets slowed down, as the case may be.
So this is a straightforward. How do I even start to know or attempt to know what type of cable has fewer problems?
By mine.
And by yours or by AudioQuest?
Yeah, I'll let you buy
No,
AudioQuest.
take
tried.
biggest bugaboo in audio, but it's not just audio, it's cars, it's anything. People want to have a handle and not be completely ignorant, but you go to buy a car and they pick some variable they think they understand to give themselves confidence. It doesn't mean that they're competent to judge that variable or the 10,000 other variables that they never asked a question about. So there's a game we all play as humans, as kind of the world's most sophisticated animals in our way, uh, of wanting to understand, but wanting to understand is the primary reason why people buy the wrong stuff because they haven't just listened to it and they've guessed at which variable might be the one that if you can just find the magic key. I have a good friend of mine, Darren Myers, who's now head of engineering for Parasound, uh, is we'll get together for a couple of hours and then 8 hours later is, well, time we better go home. Uh, and 4 hours into one of our 8 hour conversations one snowy December night a few years ago, uh, Darren just leaned back and giggled and then explained that in engineering school, he had been taught, I mean, he was taught a lot of things, but a directive was when approaching an engineering challenge and on the frontier of capability to manage that challenge, to remove the clutter and get and find where's the core of what really matters. And what we had been doing for those previous 4 hours and what we enjoy doing some of every month is the opposite, which is looking for more little details around the periphery that might not have received attention, but that incrementally all contribute to differentiating a better product from a lesser product.
Okay. I say that there is no one cable that's for everybody, and that cables have character, that some things have a better feel to them, some cables, and others are maybe more articulate or image better or whatever the case may be. They're all flawed, and because oftentimes you have to give up one thing to get the other. Um, I think that basically Bill and I probably have a different set of customers, and they probably reflect the differences in our own minds, possibly, or our own souls, whatever. There's something about the cable you listen to that pleases you, and not that it wouldn't please me, it probably would, and vice versa. There's certain characteristics um, that my cable have that people are endeared to. So I don't think there's any one ideal thing here. I think that the absolute truth of this lies somewhere between Bill and I.
It's a slightly different subject, but a very good one to bring up. If most of us, including I'm in the business, I have not heard every cable out there, or every amplifier, every speaker. In the 70s, it was a lot easier to have a comprehensive, had experience, personal. Hi-fi studios do not count personal experience in a system that you control and can swap one thing at a time, with the majority of the better gear available in the United States. I miss that. I feel incompetent today. I might brag about my Rockport speakers and Riviera Electronics and Grim DAC and such, but I can also reel off countless names of products I haven't listened to, which who knows, some of them are probably better because if there's 100 I haven't listened to, then why not expect, like, alien life on another planet? Just because you haven't found it yet doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Uh, but for cable, I do believe that there are very limited category of products, and cable is cable, power, and maybe switches prior to getting to the streamers are products where character is inexcusable. That doesn't mean there won't be some compatibility issues. Most often, it's like, say, with legacy name electronics or exposure, where they don't have a Zobel network on the output, and they're highly vulnerable to interaction with the loudspeaker. And so name tells you to use 3.5 meters of a very high inductance speaker cable to isolate the amplifier's output from the load. There are many smaller cases of that I wouldn't know to cite, and I think that's what George is referring to, is that there are a lot of little well, I use the word little, a lot of compatibility issues, but primarily one can do a bypass comparison and hear that all cable is worse than it not being there. Uh, and the truth is when it's not there, and how close did the cable come? And that's not a reference is not possible with any other part of a hi-fi system. That So to me, power cable should be chosen for cable power and cable. I didn't mean power cables, chosen for their lack of character, while every other part of a system has so much character that it is the compatibility of that character with your own priorities and the character flaws elsewhere in the system that govern whether that product will seduce you and be willing to go get naked in front of the music and get high.
Yeah, but
Because it
he's
does
right
not
about.
require a good hi-fi to get high at all. You can get just as high on earbuds and my Bluetooth Bose Flex that I'm using in the hotel room here at night. It sounds as good as my $200,000 system in the bedroom in New York or California in the moment. Doesn't mean it sounds identical. In the moment, it's doing a job for me emotionally because the hi-fi system is emotional transportation, connecting emotionally provocative software to an emotionally vulnerable animal. Uh, and that job is never done perfectly. And as I mentioned earlier about image specificity, we are fixated on that in the audio community because because we can. There are things we can't do. We can never sound real. That's bull. But there is no one way to play music. Music starts in the brain of a composer. It starts in the brain of a musician before they sit down to play. When they practice, they noodled around. The composer did things on the piano, on the guitar. And there's a feedback process. But by the time the performance is going to take place, it is an analog file, so to speak, in somebody's head. And every single performance on every single instrument in every single room is a different rendering of that file. And some of them are just lousy, if the room is lousy, but there is no only one way to play the music. In our world, we're treating the capture of a particular rendering and then using that as the provocation for a rendering in our home. And they are all different and they all sound different. And our brains acclimate, like when you move to a new home and your first reaction is, I can't live here. My hi-fi doesn't sound any good. And I have lived in one place where that really was true. It was no ever getting it to sound good. Most of the time, partly you learn the room and move your speakers around, but partly it's the brain. We, like all animals, are biased towards change, and that which doesn't change, we learn to see through. And
Yeah,
so
I think
we
that.
accommodate to our rooms, and hopefully we forgive them and have a good time getting high on music. Yes, George.
Okay, so you're talking about compatibility, which I think kind of comes back to the same place in a way. However, I believe that some people are image focused, some people are harmonics, harmonic integrity and depth seems to be the focus. I think that both of those things require the same type of integrity in the cable or system as a whole. And that getting everything compatible in that respect, once you get one, the other one usually follows with it. I don't know that it always does, but it's been my experience. But I've always dealt with extremely well-focused systems.
Um,
Let me throw in another question that's somewhat more detailed rather than the general what you are talking about. What has more impact on sound quality from 4 to 8 feet of wire and speaker cable connecting to the amp, or many more feet of wire in the coil of the passive crossover of the speaker? Does that make sense?
well, the question is a common question, more commonly in the form of, well, if the power is coming from Niagara Falls, 500 miles away, why does my 2 meter power cord make a difference? But in both cases, the core flaw in the question is the comparison to a chain is only as strong as its weakest link.
Yeah.
Uh, and that is an absolute truth, and it cannot be partially true, like partially pregnant. Uh, every single part of an audio system is flawed. And my original way of describing that and illustrating it in what I wrote in 1987 Cable Design was like a staircase where every single wire, every single part, every single component, whatever it is, gets you forward, as in closer to sound coming out of your speaker, but it's a step down. It's like a staircase. Uh, and they're all imperfect. And if you can shorten the vertical component of any one of those steps, then you didn't go down as far. And it doesn't, for the most part, there's exceptions, matter which step. That becomes a financial question. which step can I address and per dollar make the most difference in reducing that vertical down? But they're always all there. When Andy Petit was the president of Boston Acoustics, and he was giving me a tour of the factory in Boston many years ago, at one point he held out a circuit board from the crossover uh, just to show it to me, and I kind of went, pointing at uh, the stranded conductors that were coming out of the board, not yet attached on the other end. And he said, "Well, I know that's not very good, but I can't believe that matters." And then he pointed to the leads on the capacitors and resistors. And I said, "Well, two problems. Those are solid core and don't have the problems of your stranded conductor. But more importantly, surely you don't believe that if it's not a good enough receiver, people can't hear the difference between the sound of two different Boston acoustic speakers." And he said, "Oh, I get it. You're right." But it is a natural human proclivity to have that default. The chain is only as strong as its weakest link, which is an absolute truth and therefore an absolute lie when misapplied. And then there are other aspects of the nature of what a coil does compared to the wires that we're selling as speaker cable that maybe George could address better than I could for
Well,
why they're two separate issues.
to quote you, you used to say that it was like veils. Every time you would add a step, it was like adding a veil. And I often related to that in that I think that often what's added is like a type of white noise. There's just this very faint little noise that trails transients. It's an extra part, so to speak, and it veils. I think that you accumulate that as you go through a system. You got to kind of ask where the beginning point on some of this stuff is, but I think that standing harmonics in the system in the RF region are likely that. It's interesting in that the transformers that are in all of our systems are not symmetrical. And so, A, they're not symmetrical, and B, the wavelength of the RF is somewhat under 50 feet, let's say, or whatever some of the accumulated distances in your system. A lot of times things get demodulated into the ground plane and essentially reflect themselves throughout the system as sort of a standing hash. Now, it doesn't stand there very long, maybe only milliseconds, but nonetheless, it's enough to color the picture. And it's caused by accumulated distance to what a true ground would be, which we probably don't have that anyway. They're all imperfect, one reason or another, and how many links there is in the system.
George, this sounds like something you are into. Does the LC-OFC or continuous cast copper make a difference?
Oh, everything makes a difference.
Okay.
I think that the cast coppers definitely have an advantage. I mean, but there's a limit to how small you can do it in one thing or another. I don't do that. I do something very different, but it's basically how soft the copper is at the end of the day, or how amorphous it is, and the lack of grain structure and so on, and the lack of hardness in the grain structure are factors that are objective. And yes, I believe that basically the casting is a good way to do it if you can get the mechanism for it.
So here again, George is part of my story because I'm using his metals. George developed partly, I believe, as a result of not buying the Japan Energy Stress-Free 6N in the early 90s that I started buying. George didn't want to pay for it, and he figured out how to make something better. That was not from ASCAST either. 1985, I started putting Hitachi's LCOFC is Hitachi, and I started putting that in cables in 1985. Hitachi had offered Monster an exclusive. Monster wasn't interested, and so Hitachi said they would do it themselves. So I couldn't buy from Hitachi, but Richard Vandersteen ordered internal conductor for his speakers that were to the spec I wanted in my cables, and Richard provided the conduit for me to use Hitachi LC-OFC in my Type 10 speaker cable and AFC interconnect in 1985. I had not paid attention to metal quality particularly before that, but I had stepped up to using OFC or OFHC, oxygen-free high conductivity, which is a standard commodity product. And I didn't realize that it's actually not at all standardized relative to the priorities of those of us in the audio business. Because I was buying, in 1987, I started buying PC-OCC from Sumitomo. Sumitomo and Furukawa at the time were the only licensees for the patent on Ono continuous casting. Later on, because of the end, company in Taiwan became the third licensee. There were 3 licensees for Ono continuous casting. I bought from Sumitomo because they cast a 12 millimeter diameter rod. Furukawa cast a 15 millimeter diameter rod. Well, the bigger the rod is, the more damage you do in the process of drawing it down to the sizes that we need. The smallest that OCC, at least at that time, could be cast was 1 millimeter diameter, which is like an 18 gauge conductor, which is too big to use for audio by itself. However, for aluminum, which has less skin effect than copper, which has less skin effect than silver, so there's more skin effect the more conductive the metal. They did make aluminum sounding cables that in pure as cast that actually were quite good. They were drawing from that 12 meter diameter rod. Neotech in Taiwan was drawing from 8 millimeter, but for whatever reasons, it was not yet a superior result, or it was close enough that it didn't compel me to change suppliers. But later, when George sampled me in 1999, with the metal that he had developed for himself, and you asked me what size, and I said, well, I've got a library of 22 gauge, and that was what I used to listen to when you gave me a sample. That was an astonishingly good metal, and it was as good as the 6.9s annealed soft copper that I was at that time buying from Dowa. Another different Japanese company. I had switched from Japan Energy because whatever it was in their processing, the 6.9s from Dowa was just a little bit better, but repeatedly. And if it's better and it costs the same, then that's what I'm going to do. See, I'm the customer, George is the inventor. We got different roles. But because before sort of throwing my whole line up in the air and redesigning a bunch of things, I wanted to finish the investigation of OCC, and I had Sumitomo make for me copper audio-sized conductors drawn from 2 millimeter rod, 4 millimeter rod, 8 millimeter rod, and the 12 millimeter rod that I was already working with. And the progression was very straightforward. But even the 2 millimeter, drawing from a 2 millimeter as cast, through a process the same as Hitachi. Hitachi LCOFC, what was special was a slow drawing process to try to minimize the disruption in the grain structure. And basically the same process that Vanden Hal invented at the same time, or applied at the same time, when he created Vanden Hal's monocrystal. And why they all use the word crystal when they're not crystals, they're grains. But the heck, that goes on till today. But I had an interesting time trying to tell the story when I was selling the Sumitomo drawn PC-OCC with its 200-foot long grains, but many of them, as my lesser. I had 4 levels as my one step up in copper. And the next step up was well, no, the grains are very short, but the way they fit together with the higher purity was more like they were flat surfaces touching each other instead of rounded areas. Impurities in copper grains coalesce at the surface. So you have some of the same problem internally in a copper conductor that you have when bare strands touch on the outside. The bare strands touch on the outside are mechanically moving in response to the change in the current flow. That doesn't happen inside. But it's the hashiness of listening to stranded bare copper is some of the same sonic signature as listening to inferior copper in terms of what goes wrong at the grain junctions inside of the metal. And it's not coincidental.
So one thing I've noticed, that a couple of things that tie together here. First of all, with respect to corrosion and so on, it does make a horrible difference in the product. Is the supermarket effect. It's why over a period of time, the screechy sound they get in their PA systems and stuff is because basically the wire gets so corroded it just turns to shit. But anyway, back into '99, I was already well into the refining of copper thing. And so in my cables and my brochures, I said my cable was 99.99% pure or whatever. Well, at some point in time, I get these guys in suits at my front door of my shop threatening to sue me. And they're going to take me to court and whatnot for saying that my copper was such and such purity. And I go, well, fine. So, but at the time, there was a lot of recycled copper. It was hard to get very pure copper to begin with because of recycling laws, and even infinitesimal amounts of iron and stuff in the copper make it useless. So everybody in the industry was sort of a slave to the Japanese at the time, who were charging ridiculous prices for the copper. It was like, stop, you know. And so at that point, I decided, well, I have an obligation here. I should just go ahead and sell the product or whatever. And because Bill and I had discussed it, but that's what got me into the copper business per se, was those guys threatening me because it bothered me, you know, or something to that effect. It makes a difference, though.
That's the short answer to the question is yes. And this is, I look back and I think how childish of me. In 1993, I think it was, when Japan Energy was soliciting my business and went around the country soliciting many companies. Roger Scoff, XLO, was one of the other users of Japan Energy's 6/9 copper. That I had them give me enough metal that I could put it into a production run of a model called Emerald Interconnect at the time, not realizing, which I had then knew for years by the time George gave me a sample in '99, don't have to listen to a cable. You can listen to just the metal without any dielectric other than air, which has some big advantages. If you really want to build your own cable, the place to start is uninsulated
Yeah, for sure.
conductor. Because the results are the same, but it's a heck of a lot easier to just listen to two bare wires connected to an RCA plug. We usually put heat shrink that we don't shrink over one of them, just so we don't casually short. But and that's still what I was doing for judging directionality. First in the analog domain with two of those cables. Later on, I found that there was more difference in directionality in the digital domain for good reason. And so I only had to make up one cable with two RCA plugs on the end to hear directionality with a digital cable. Today we go a step farther. Garth has a setup where he cuts 3 inches, actually just simply cuts the earth of a power cable, so the ground connection of a power cable, and inserts with alligator clips 3 inches of the conductor that we're judging the directionality of. And it makes it the most obvious because you're not judging, there's no skin effect. When you get to judging, and I use in my speaker cables 20 gauge, well, I use, but predominantly 20, 18, 16, 14 gauge. And by the time you get to 16 gauge, 14 gauge, the cable is just, the single conductor just sounds really bad. You don't want, you say, like, there's no right or wrong here. These are both wrong. So judging directionality is a more irritating process to have to go through. But since it is RF that is subject to the directionality and not the signal, that's really our relevant problem, having it be the ground path on a power cable is actually the most black and white, simplest way of judging the efficacy of which way are you, is the RF being steered.
It also speaks to the significance of resonance in the ground path. You know, but I remember back in the day that, speaking of things that got me going here a long time ago, CDs for one thing, I thought they just sounded horrible. You know, I mean, from my perspective, it was really wrong, but everybody was so immersed in them, it became a an initiative to get in and see if we can't fix something here, I suppose, you know. But remember Noel, he sold, at that time, he was selling all this parallel twin. Well, at the time, I was using lamp cord because that was what's convenient. So I thought, well, if I'm going to figure out the cable thing, I need to go buy monster cable. So I went and bought the parallel pin, the parallel twin, which to my ear sounded worse than the lamp cable.
It was. That's
And it
why I
was,
use it today in my shares listening evaluations. We
it's so
start with the
shitty,
12
you know.
gauge monster.
That's cheating. But but anyway, so yeah, good choice, Bill. But no, the parallel twin was dog shit. And the but he made another one called Hot Wires, and it was a twisted pair of roughly the same gauge with a transparent thing on it, and it was way better. And I went, well, geez, you know, why is this guy selling both of these products? And it had nothing to do with what they sounded like. You know, it only had to do with what they looked like or mechanical functionality or something. You know, I went, Jesus, why make the two products? And that was a huge impetus for me getting in the business, because selling merit-based product uh, with respect to the music, propagating the music and so on, was so much more important than what it looked like.
Chris Monster's original cable, MC500, it was often called because it came on 500-foot spools, monster cable. Uh, that for 239 strands per side, rope lay, uh, a, a bad construction. Before Noel started Monster Cable in 1979, in 1977, while a rep in Northern California, and he's changed the story later, but his first version is the more truthful one. He was lying in his hotel bed out in a motel outside Fresno, where he was calling on dealers the next day. And he had the idea that he should distribute cable. And he started selling 12 gauge cable from Saxton, an electrical cable supplier, large zip cord, hard PVC jacket, kind of obnoxious, 63 strands per side, which is a standard random bunch put
Yeah.
up for 12 gauge, tinned on one side, bare copper on the other. Uh,
I,
and
I find it curious that you can remember how many strands are in all your different other people's cable. I can't even remember in my own.
whatever. We all have our useless
Yeah,
info in our.
it's amazing. But
The
anyway, go
61
ahead.
strands is what I use in some of my power cables because concentric. Uh, my when I use the concentric conductors, the strands are all the same size, well, except for a model called Q2. George's, he explained how and why they vary. But when the strand sizes are the same, 6 fits around 1, that's 7. 12 fits around 7, that's 19. And then another 18 makes for 37, and the next layer is 61. So
Yeah, I was
that's what.
just gonna say that.
So 63 happens to be a random bunch that is standardized, but random bunch is generally inferior, but would be superior if you were worried about high frequency radio frequency conductivity. Concentric would be the enemy because the whole bunch acts like a single solid in not in all ways, but in some ways. Uh, but so that cable was 50 cents a foot, hardware store wire. When Noel brought out the monster cable, it cost $1 a foot. Uh, and it was, as George said, grossly inferior because it had so many more strands and a soft jacket. Because the hardness of the jacket makes a pronounced slap in your ears difference in a stranded cable. The Japanese kind of thing the Japanese were into much earlier than I was. Uh, Pioneer was laying conductor in a trough that they would then fill with epoxy. Uh, I don't want to
Yeah,
categorize any one nationality or having a proclivity, but the Japanese
they liked it.
will take something and then carry it to an extreme, sometimes at the expense of other variables. And so somebody, it's more like engineer's disease in my mind than maybe something Japanese. There are just a lot of good Japanese engineers. Because I have a whole story about how it is I came up. Well, I'll get there. Actually, I'll try to be quick. So, but Noel made a cable that had lower impedance because it was 12 gauge than the free 22 gauge lamp cord that came with your speakers at the time. So the real enemy was the 22 gauge lamp cord, not the 12 gauge lamp cord. And so when Knoll as a distributor was selling electrical wire, yeah, some people bought it. I bought a spool from him in 1977. But the scale of the business was nothing like building in the profit margin for a dealer and for him and such that Monster Cable had. So Monster Cable was an incrementally more expensive cable to make with all those strands, because it costs more. The more strands you have, the more processing you're paying for, more machine time. So his cable cost a few percent more. He sold it for twice as much, but it wasn't nearly as good. How did he get away with it? Well, the comparison was never against 12 gauge lamp cord. The comparison was against 22 gauge zip cord. And was it worth paying $20 for enough cable to hook up your speakers with Monster Cable? And the answer is yes. It was a huge improvement, clearly worth $20 to use a 12 gauge cable. It was not, the question wasn't which is the best 12 gauge twin. The question was use what comes for free in the box or use the Monster Cable for $20, which today is $100. And it was still a bargain. So the way I put it, it's as though Monster Cable was worth 25 cents and you pay 75 cents to have it be visible to you so you could act on it. And so on one hand, I'm complimenting Monster as having done a real service of helping people have better hi-fi by bringing out one of the worst designed, second worst design cables ever made. The worst was Powerline 2, where he took 4 of the same conductors and spiraled them. By the time of Hot Wires, which was their AutoSign line, so that came later, Bruce Brisson had been hired by Knoll and brought out Powerline 2, which was, you could say in a sense, the first generation of MIT cable, which was not a bad cable. At that time, Randall Research, AudioQuest FMS cable, and the Monster were the three of us were kind of the high-end speaker cables before George came along.
Well, in honor about that time, Knoll actually made a little interconnect cable, a little blue one, and it was quite good. I mean, it was like, yeah, that's better. I think
Interlink 300, I think.
Yeah,
too.
It was a good product.
And it was a single ended, it was a twisted pair with a shield connected to one end. Knoll's, a lot of Knoll's cables were competent in the sense that I mentioned Mogami Belden. His first video cable he designed himself and it was terrible. And then he let the engineers do it. And then he had the second best aftermarket video cables because they were properly made. Although I enjoyed comparing 164 feet on a spool, 50 meters of my S1 video, back in the days of before component video, after composite video, S video. I would at CEDIA shows, I would use Monster's best top of the line 1 meter S cable against my less expensive cable on a 164-foot spool, and the difference was right there on a screen. People, when you can see something, it is more actionable. We know how important audio is. No movie, no horror film has any scare factor without the sound. I mean, that's where all the emotion is. But there's a priority in our perceptual system for the eye. And so when somebody does see a difference in the video domain, it's actionable. And not like, oh, can you play it again? Where in audio, you're always trying to capture this thing that can't be captured.
Well, audio you can feel more too. But no, the cable that he made was Interlink 400.
It was the next model up.
I like that. But was that one of Bruce's designs?
I think he'd moved on by then to start MIT. But the 1000, I think, or was interconnect before, forgetting the fellow's name, who became the designer after Bruce left, who then voiced the cables to be a little irritating in comparison to being the slightly asleep of Bruce's designs.
Well, gentlemen, the next question has to do with actually using Bill Design as a way of installing your system. The question is, can I make a useful decision based on Bill Design without having to connect up a bunch of different cables every time I make a change in the rest of the system?
Well, then you get to my view, which is that there is an absolute. Uh, Financial efficacy, there's a lot of personal things about what somebody should buy, but the comparison, when you can compare a cable to no cable and speaker cable, again, can be some compatibility issues that would get in the way, but otherwise it's fairly easy. There's wire inside the speaker, there's wire inside the amplifier, there's the wire in between. If you add an additional cable between, say, the amplifier and the other wire, don't replace it, but add it, the sound quality will go down, and you remove that cable and the sound quality will go up. And regardless of whether the system is a bright system or a dull system, it doesn't matter because you're judging on an absolute basis and not judging the compatibility of one distortion in the context of other distortions. And once one gets closer to the truth, to neutral, then that performance is predictable and carries across to different speakers. But when,
Well,
say, in the day and age when teal was very popular, it's amazing how many people did not like teal speakers, considering how successful teal was. The speakers are like people in your room, as compared to cable, which is like out of sight, out of mind. People change their cable a lot more often than they change their speakers because there's loyalty to a speaker. There's comparatively no loyalty to a cable. So people would love their teal speakers, but look for a cable that would tone down the bright sound. And I say, no, you can exacerbate that with an irritating cable. If it was like early straight wire with its fine-grained irritation, or I don't want to mention any current cables that might be known for their brightness, subjective brightness, not amplitude brightness. Uh, but you can't take a speaker that is itself irritating. Well, you can try, but if you get a cable that smothers the sound, uh, defocuses it, so to speak, then you might be able to live with your speaker, but you're not solving the problem. Just if you
well,
don't
that
like
was
the
the
speaker,
same.
don't keep the speaker.
That was true. That was true in the early CD days too. That sometimes smothering it was better than listening to it, though.
Well, yes, I made when I had Paul McLaren from New Zealand came to me about electronics and built a
Hmm.
line of electronics that I was then the distributor in North America. We put a high pass, well, a low pass filter, put a high frequency filter on the CD input uh, because so much garbage getting into a solid state circuit, transient
Hmm.
modulation, distortion, and other mechanisms. George could explain much better than I can. It's just irritation. Turn down that irritation.
Yeah, it was terrible. But there's another factor here that an audiophile, if you're dedicated and you can put your expectations aside and actually witness whatever is going on when you change cable, there's something to be said for better is better. A lot of times you put something in and you go, shit, that's better, or nah. And it's an instantaneous response, not based upon any one factor other than the fact that, geez, that's just better. And that can be substantial. It's and I think it revolves a lot around the individual product or link integrity. I mean, if the rest of the system is stationary, you're changing the one thing, whatever it is, and sometimes it's just better.
All ties rise, kind of a better
Yeah.
sometime, or the other direction sometimes.
Mhm.
But when there are flaws, then there's some degree of character and personality, and it's very easy to fall into comparing two versions of wrong without finding out what right is. It's like choosing whether to have your tone arm and your stylus rake angle, choosing whether to have your tone arm too high or too low. If you never find the correct place and never get that lock-in imaging that you can't get any other way, then you think it's tempting to think, and many people do, and even in the analog world today, that adjusting the stylus rake angle is akin to adjusting a tone control, because when the tone arm is too high, it is a subjectively treble forward, and when the tone arm is too low, it's subjectively bass forward. It's not about amplitude, it's about the brain's ability to decode the 50 milliseconds it takes before the electrical signal from our ear goes through our processing and is given to our consciousness. It's about a 50 millisecond delay. Very complicated process of memory and imagination and what ifs as it tries to say to interpret the data. It's not a real one-to-one relationship ever. And So a lot of things sound bright and irritating, and then I really pisses me off when reviewers will talk about the rising top end of some cable. I say that's better than cold fusion. All we need in this world is a lot of bad wire and get more energy out than you put in. I mean, it's just crazy, but people, that even a lot of the professionals in our industry do say things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, they're hooked into a specific one thing or another. Do you remember Enid Lumley?
I only met her once personally, but yeah, she was a figure
She was
that
special.
Harry put her out there, and she was on the
Oh
stage for a
God, she had a
decade.
set of ears. She had a set of ears on her. I'll tell you that. She could tell you what her system sounded like by time of day. You know,
Well, that was about power, right? But
if you say
uh,
so. I
she
think it
was
probably was, but
she was very alert. But she also said that if it was a silver colored component, then it would sound bright. Which I'm sorry, I don't go there.
is that a step over the line?
For me, we all have lines of things that might make a difference, but we can't investigate all frontiers equally. So I acknowledge there are things I've not maybe paid enough attention to. Maybe I haven't paid enough attention to cryogenics, but I did pay enough to for me to believe it's not a path. Other people, um, I guess
If you have
I
really
can be
bad wire,
cynical and say it's a great way to charge more for stuff.
I think that it's a form of annealing. And I think that it could have legitimacy. It probably wouldn't make any difference in anything we do, but I'm sure there's places where it does make a difference.
CDs. When Stereophile invited,
Yeah, cryogenically treating a CD.
they absolutely do. When Stereophile invited me to address the writers' conference in 1990, uh, I Robert Harley made a presentation to the group of doing blind. I mean, he was not double blind, but blind comparisons with. I think Ed Meitner had was had a service of cryogenically freezing CDs, and Robert Harley was the technical director at Stereophile at the time. Uh, Played the different CDs, and the difference was pretty pronounced, and none of us knew which was which. I learned something about the reviewing community in that particular
Oh
episode
boy, you should.
because none of the reviewers for Stereophile, not one, would said anything. They would not choose. And maybe they would have if you'd wait long enough, but I couldn't stand it after a minute or something of saying nothing. And I said, that one's better. And it was the one that was cryogenically frozen, which was Robert's point. Uh, but what I did learn is that reviewers are scared to death of each other.
Yeah, well, I remember Michael Gindey did a green pen thing, and it was on nationwide TV on NBC or whatever. And I happened to watch it, and it was like he had two CDs, one that had the green pen and one that didn't. He put it in there, and I don't know what or why or anything, but I tell you, it was a human voice that they were using, and the difference in the human voice over the TV set, me sitting on the other end of the country was like, well, shit, that's the better one of the two, which is neither here nor there. I don't even remember which one it was. But the odd thing was that none of the talking heads from NBC acknowledged that they heard any difference. And I went, oh my God, if they couldn't hear the difference in that, they couldn't hear the difference in a human voice, whether the person was telling the truth or not. I mean, subtleties of emotion and stuff was what was affected. And because so could they not hear it, or were they not permitted by the politic of their situation of acknowledging it? Much as AES, remember AES? They did a bunch of demos at AES, and I was sitting in the hall with an executive from AES when they were swapping cables or amplifiers or something. Like, well, shit, that one's better. And he goes, yeah, but we could never admit that.
Well, that's a weird one. But yes, double blind testing is what I call it's an opportunity for embarrassment. So it's a major corruption. It's an influence. It's not a neutral test because it is an opportunity for embarrassment. Double blind ABX testing can be a valuable tool, but when it's treated as though it's God, same problem with the facility in Northridge, California, where Harman and JBL have a major facility, and they have a room where within 2 seconds, a speaker mounted on a platform can be moved out of the way, and a different speaker is moved into the same position, so that you can't use localization of the speaker as a way of knowing which speaker you're listening to. Uh, it's an interesting presentation to hear. The speakers are behind a scrim. You cannot see what speaker you're listening to. Uh, but it highlights an awful lot of foibles in human perception. And so, if misused, that way of comparing speakers is highly deceptive. But if it is not treated as the holy grail that then must be reinforced through other measurements, but as one of many perspectives, it can be useful. But as a generalization, what I refer to as engineer's disease is a proclivity to narrow the variables to the one that makes the most difference. And none of the best hi-fi in the world comes from the people who do that. Except maybe from Peter Walker, who famously said he didn't have to listen to the quad when he designed it. But he's the exception. For the rest of us, you don't make a superior product if you're not listening to it, because we don't understand well enough the way in which perception works to externally measure the importance of the damage caused in audio. Because some damage we don't notice, and other damage, tiny bits of odd high harmonic versus larger amounts of second harmonic is maybe the most famous example. One is entirely forgivable and maybe even enjoyable, and the other one is just always wrong. So
Okay.
good design requires that 50% of the process is in the listener, and then that does vary person to person because we have experience and we are using history in our algorithms for what we hear and what we notice. If you've only ever used stranded cable, then you climb up the ladder of a better and better stranded cable without knowing that you could go down to the hardware store and buy bell wire and make a better cable for practically free than some of the expensive stranded cables. Anyway, all that matters is that you give yourself permission to turn off your critical faculties and be naked in front of the music. Let it take you away.
That is a good statement.
Thank you.
It's just, yeah, maybe it's akin to suspension of disbelief.
Well, even the idea of believing is actually a flaw because
Yeah.
you don't have to believe. It's asking it to be real that is the problem. It never is real, but if you don't ask it to be real, if you recognize that every rendering is different, and the question is it effective? The home theater business, in that sense, is more honest than the audio business because they call all sound effects, and so is our business. And the question is the effect as good as it can be? And am I having a good time and I want to do it again?
There are a few other questions that have come in. We're coming up about 9 minutes to go, as what I promised our speakers. Let me jump in with a couple of more items. Do you recommend what happens when you combine copper and silver or plated conductors? And what about various configurations of wire layout? Do they make a difference in if the impedance is the same?
Um,
That's only three things.
We
it makes
both
a
have
difference.
answers. Go ahead,
Well,
George.
yeah, I think at the end of the day, silver is inherently a better product. Um, I mean, it's a better conductor, has a little more skin core effect, as the case may be, but um, it has attributes that come in handy in a design. Um, I'm pretty solid on my geometries at this point in time, but I find that the very core strand, let's say the center strand itself, is whether it's copper or silver, is even though it's the tiniest part of the conductor at all, it definitely makes a very noticeable positive difference. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of difference. I mean, there certainly is.
Well, George is referring to something that I would never do in an interconnect, but that I do in speaker cable because there's so much metal that the smallest conductor actually makes the largest difference.
Yeah.
In my case, it's partly because my smallest conductors are 20 gauge, which is huge compared to what George uses. But it's the only conductor size in my speaker wires cables that does not have audible skin effect. Compared to a 21 gauge, 22 gauge, 23 gauge, they all sound a little different. Even though they're radially symmetrical, they are still have a profile. And George would probably talk about the resonance and other reasons for that better than I can. Larger than 20 gauge, they're not just different, they're wrong. You listen to a single 19 gauge of the same metal, you say, oh, where'd the air go, and I'm not hearing his breath, or sort of the finer
Yeah.
detail seems to be less apparent, but without distorting the signal in the sense of uh, changing its character, but just losing something. 18 gauge, only one square 1 millimeter diameter, uh, introduces a subjective roller coaster. It's subjective because it is the result of the processing I'm referring going on in those 50 milliseconds, because it's not what actually happens to the amplitude, but subjectively, but starting with 18 gauge and even worse with 17 gauge and 16 gauge, uh, the bass is very tight, well defined, with lack of body warmth, fullness. The mid range, treating the mid range as the center point. Like if you've got an equalizer, I never like three band equalizers in a car. I leave the mid range alone and worry about the ends rather than messing up the middle. Uh, but the but relative to the middle, the upper bass is tight but constipated in the warmth. But there's not a lack of low bass energies. It's just the harmonic progression between that defines an instrument versus just a pure sine wave, and how the brain is processing these pieces that are beginning to be treated differently. Uh, and then the upper mid range is sort of pushed, forced, a little bit like Sarah Nora Jones recording. I like Nora Jones. I'm not picking on her, but her recording is notable for the fashion of the time of her first album, where the vocal is put forward. A lot of complicated processing goes on in the recording. What kind of mic? It's a plate mic, and what they did. Nothing. The idea that we're going to ever sound real when there's all that purposeful distortion in the recording is doesn't mean the recordings are bad. It means they're doing their job to give us an impression. It doesn't mean it's accurate. Uh, so the I go sideways.
I think
I
there's an
lay too much groundwork. But the top end. So there's a subjective roller coaster where somebody listening to an 18 gauge conductor would say, "Oh, who messed with the equalizer?" But none of that is in the amplitude domain, or almost none of it. Uh,
well,
it is predominantly in phase. Yes.
yeah, I think when if you go on my net site and dig around, there's a demonstration that's very easy to do. If you take a loop of wire, just take a piece of wire and bend it in half and hang it, and just you can use a 9-volt battery or whatnot, and you touch the two thing together, the wire will jump apart like that. So the wire moves with relationship to itself. Now that's based on current in base a lot. In other words, you do the same thing with high frequency AC signal, and nothing would happen. So, and I do believe that motion absorbs energy. And basically, I think what happens is a relationship between the bass note and the bass harmonic that's somewhere in there. There's a very slight phasing difference to take place. Probably not measurable. I don't know. I've never tried it, but it has a lot to do with the perceived bass. You know, a lot of times you don't hear the bottom note because of the note above it, that somehow it's a continuity to hear it. It's not that it's not there. I think it is there, but I've seen examples of cables and system where the bass just seemed to disappear. You know, and obviously it couldn't have. So, but anyway, I think there's phase relationships in here that come into play.
Well, I'm talking about single solid conductor. So
Yeah,
not
well,
down
which
into the,
they wouldn't have that.
it wouldn't have
You know,
that effect.
the
But our brains,
larger and stronger the conductor is, the less it's going to move with respect to the current that's going through it, just because it's simply stiffer and more massive. Whereas a
but
bunch of fine fuzz is not the same thing.
so one of the ironies of, say, Bruce Brisson's MIT cables, uh, and he's not exactly relevant in today's market, but there's a leftover there, is that he had little thin treble wires, larger mid-range wires, and the biggest conductors were bass wires. Well, the largest amount of the surface with 100% current density at all frequencies was on the bass conductors, not on the treble conductors, because cumulatively they had less surface than the bass conductors. Uh, so a lot of jokes were made about MIT cable. One of the popular ones was, we'll take the treble conductors and put them into an AC outlet And you won't get electrocuted because the treble conductors only carry high frequencies. Uh, so,
Let
but
me
Bruce
try that.
would come back with how his network is that it's a more complicated process and there's really like a crossover and the bass conductors really are bass. But I'm sorry, I'm not there. But bypass effect, something else that George maybe think of when he talked about this, even if it's a single silver conductor that's very small at the center of one of his cables, bypass effect is huge. I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to put a zero point zero 0.01 high quality capacitor across some big electrolytic, and it's like an
I
irrelevant
believe that's it. Yeah, I think
change.
you hit the nail on the head there. I believe that's correct.
So that is a well-known phenomenon,
Yeah.
and it's partly in the electrical domain, but it is also partly, to me, in the brain. That when we listen in those 50 milliseconds of interpreting a sound, the brain starts with trying to create a skeleton that it then fills in. My analogy is to a children's coloring book. And there were those black lines showing you the pig on the farm and the pony on the carousel, the unicorn, whatever you might find in a kid's toddler's coloring book. It doesn't matter how badly the child fills in that picture, the definitiveness that it's a pig on the farm or pony on the carousel is unaltered. And I think that's an analogy to the bypass effect in the neurological domain, that the brain builds a skeleton. If you listen to a first order speaker like a Vandersteen or a Thiel, uh, there's some others, and you compare it to a fourth order speaker, there are a number of things that are different. So it's a complex relationship. But in that, when you switch from a first order, which is able to maintain an impulse response that a fourth order speaker can't maintain, although it has many other advantages, uh, the brain has to relearn the way it built its model of how to present sound to your consciousness. So if you listen to a Vandersteen and then you make a relatively quick change, I'm not talking about instant A being, that's got its own flaws, which I attack in the case of that Northridge JBL facility with, it's like having a bunch of sunglasses out on a counter and you pick them up and you compare the color, but they're all tinted, meaning you have no neutral. You're always comparing wrong to wrong. And you might come up with a color preference. If you left any of them on long enough, and not assuming they're not, yellow or rose-colored glasses, within a certain range, the sky is blue, the grass is green. The brain sorts through that. We don't have absolute color sense. We have relative color sense. But in that comparison, that's all you have to compare when you're comparing speakers the way they do at the JBL facility. But if you were comparing 50 sunglasses and you had them on for 15 minutes at a time, you would no longer focus so much on the tint, but the ones that had a distorted lens would give you a headache, and you wouldn't want them. And so my complaint about many of these attempts to make quick comparisons is that they highlight sometimes the almost irrelevant variable at the expense of the variable that you would truly care about the most if you were watching or listening for a longer
Yeah.
time.
I think the problem with that type of a thing is your mind becomes engaged. You're not just experiencing it, you're reflecting at the same time, which puts a filter into what's going on. I think one of the most profound speaker experiences I ever had is back in the 70s. I walked into Tower Records and they were playing something over the speakers, probably a record or something. I went, oh my God, that sounds good. And it was Vandersteen's.
They had Vandersteens in Westwood, maybe some of
Yeah.
the other ones. Uh, Arrival, impulse response was probably less important than the tonal voicing. And something about record store systems just make you buy music. There's like
That's the idea. Yeah.
they're their own magic category where they're not doing what the audiophiles do, and neither did I. I was building kits and buying records and trading hi-fi before I ever had a system where I had two speakers set up in a triangle the way I do today. I had equidistant speakers, but depending on the living environment, one was sideways, one was the other way, one was the actual fixation on a triangle, which is the only way to get with absolute equal distance, the only way to get much of what we prize the most as audiophiles.
True. That's math.
It's not where people started, and I probably suspect for a fair number of you, it wasn't either. It's two bookshelf speakers, they used to be called, but they were huge, on either side of the sofa, kind of like giant headphones. Immersion. Everything else about hi-fi is irrelevant if it doesn't succeed at immersion. Uh, the intellectual process of, can I tell whether I'm in
Yeah,
row
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
in at Carnegie Hall is not productive actually to just getting lost in the music.
Yeah, it's
Gentlemen,
true.
I promised you to give you an opportunity to leave the session at just about this time. We're going to turn off the recording after thanking you. Would you all clap a little bit for these guys having given us their time? And
I'll clap for George.
you now know why they have received the Founders Award from the Los Angeles and Orange County Audio Society. Thank you all. Let me stop the recording and then we will continue.